They told me the night shift at the abandoned railway station would be easy money. Just monitor the old platforms, check for intruders, and file basic incident reports. What they didn't tell me was why 4 security guards had quit in the past month. What they didn't mention was the reason the station's been officially closed since 2019, but somehow still appears on arrival boards throughout the city. I found the job through a contact at the Municipal Transportation Authority. Janet Kozlov, a supervisor I'd worked with during my brief stint as a subway maintenance tech 3 years back. She called me on a Tuesday evening in late September while I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at a stack of medical bills that had been growing taller each week since my diagnosis. The cancer treatment had drained everything, not just financially, though that was the obvious part. The insurance covered maybe 60% of what the oncologist called standard care protocols. The rest came out of savings that evaporated faster than I could track. But it was more than money. The whole experience had left me feeling like I was watching my life happen to someone else. Like I was observing my own existence from the outside, unable to quite participate in it anymore. I needed work that didn't require standing for 8-hour shifts or lifting anything heavier than a clipboard. Something that would let me sit quietly and think without having to explain to anyone why some days I moved slower than others. Why sometimes I needed to pause in the middle of conversations to catch up with what my own body was doing. If you've ever felt like you were watching your own life from the outside, you might understand what I'm about to tell you. And if you enjoy stories about places that exist in the spaces between normal life, consider subscribing. Janet's offer seemed straightforward enough. Eastwick Terminal had been decommissioned as an active station when they rerouted the Eastern Line through the downtown corridor. The building itself was structurally sound, but no longer served passengers. The city kept it monitored as part of their municipal property oversight program, mostly to prevent vandalism and unauthorized access. $12 an hour, 4 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Health insurance through the Municipal Employees Union if I stayed on for more than 90 days. I didn't ask why they needed someone new. I should have, but the insurance part made everything else seem negotiable. I told Janet I'd take it. She met me at the station on a Thursday night to walk me through the basics. Eastwick Terminal sits on the eastern edge of the city, built in 1987 when the metro system was expanding rapidly and no one had quite figured out how much space they'd actually need. It's a large building, much bigger than most suburban stops, with 3 underground platforms connected by a main concourse level and an upper administrative floor that housed offices for route planning and maintenance coordination. The architecture is that particular late 80s style of municipal optimism. High ceilings, large windows, lots of open space designed to handle crowds that never quite materialized in the numbers the planners had projected. Wide corridors with good sight lines, public art installations that haven't aged well, and the kind of industrial carpeting that shows every stain but somehow never looks completely dirty. Janet showed me the security office on the main concourse level. A small room with banks of monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the building. A desk with a computer terminal connected to the municipal monitoring system. And a set of keys that opened every door in the facility except the ones that required electronic access cards, which had been deactivated when the station closed. The job requirements were simple enough. Walk the building once every 2 hours, checking all levels and platforms. Log any unusual activity or maintenance issues in the incident report system. Make sure all exterior doors remained properly secured. If anyone attempted unauthorized entry, contact municipal security first, then file a report detailing the circumstances. Janet handed me a laminated sheet with additional protocols. I read through it while she organized the desk equipment and tested the radio system. Never go below platform level between 2:17 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. unless responding to a direct emergency call for municipal dispatch. If you hear announcements over the public address system during this period, ignore them completely and remain on the main concourse level. Do not attempt to identify the source of any announcements. Log them as routine system maintenance audio checks in your reports. If you encounter individuals on the platforms who appear to be waiting for transportation, verify their reason for being in the building. Anyone who claims to be waiting for a train should be politely informed that the station is no longer in service and directed to the nearest active station, which is Millbrook Junction, approximately 2 miles north. If they refuse to leave or insist that trains are still running, contact municipal security immediately and do not engage further. The computer terminal will occasionally display arrival and departure information for trains that do not exist. This is a known software issue related to legacy programming that hasn't been fully removed from the system. Do not log these displays as errors or attempt to contact technical support. Simply note, System displays active in your routine monitoring log. If you hear train sounds including engines, brakes, or arrival announcements coming from the platform levels, investigate only during approved hours. Outside the restricted time period mentioned above, these sounds typically indicate maintenance work being conducted by contracted crews who may not coordinate their schedules with security personnel. Document the sounds in your log, but do not interfere with work activities. The elevators to the administrative level are locked and should remain locked. The stairwells to this level are accessible, but the doors at the top require electronic key cards that are no longer active. Do not attempt to access the administrative level under any circumstances. If you observe light or activity on this level, log it as authorized maintenance crew activity and do not investigate further. Never answer the station's main telephone line after 1 a.m. unless the caller identifies themselves as municipal security or emergency services. If the phone rings during restricted hours and you answer, hang up immediately if the caller asks about train schedules, delays, or passenger assistance. Log all after-hours calls as misdirected service inquiries. I looked up from the sheet. Janet was adjusting the monitor displays and didn't seem to be waiting for questions, but I had several. The restricted time period, I said. What kind of maintenance requires avoiding the platforms for over an hour? Janet kept her attention on the monitors. Infrastructure assessments. The platforms are built over utility tunnels that service multiple municipal systems. Sometimes crews need to run tests that create unsafe air quality or noise levels. Easier to schedule it consistently than try to coordinate around a security patrol. And the announcements. Legacy automation system. Parts of the station's computer network are still connected to the Central Transit Authority database. Sometimes it receives routine system pings and tries to process them as operational data. The speakers activate automatically when certain data comes through. It's harmless, but can be startling if you're not expecting it. I accepted these explanations because they sounded reasonable and because I needed the job. Janet finished setting up the workstation and showed me how to access the incident reporting software. She left around 11:30, and I was alone in Eastwick Terminal for the first time. The building felt different without another person in it, but not in a way that seemed threatening. Just larger, quieter, more aware of its own space. I could hear the ventilation system cycling through its routines, the subtle electrical hum of the lighting, and the occasional settling sounds that large buildings make when they're not full of people moving around and absorbing the small noises with their presence. I started my first patrol at midnight. The main concourse level was straightforward to navigate. Wide hallways connected the central area where passengers would have waited with the various entrances, exits, ticket areas, and service corridors. Everything was clean and well-maintained, just empty. The kind of empty that suggested recent use rather than abandonment. The stairs down to the platform level were broad and clearly marked. Platform A served eastbound trains, Platform B served westbound, and Platform C had been designated for local service that never actually began operation. Each platform was a long, straight corridor with bench seating, electronic information displays that were dark, and the standard safety equipment you'd find at any metro station. I walked the length of each platform, checking that all areas were secure and noting the layout in case I needed to move through the space quickly during future shifts. The platforms were well lit and showed no signs of unauthorized access. The tracks themselves were still present and appeared to be maintained, though Janet had mentioned that they were no longer connected to the active transit network. The only thing that struck me as unusual was how clean everything looked. Most decommissioned public spaces accumulate dust, debris, or at least the kind of subtle neglect that comes from reduced maintenance. Eastwick Terminal looked like it had been cleaned recently and thoroughly. The floors showed no scuff marks, the bench surfaces had no accumulated grime, and even the safety equipment appeared to have been recently inspected. I finished the platform level and returned to the main concourse by 12:45 a.m. My log entry for the first patrol was brief. All areas secure, no maintenance issues observed, no unauthorized personnel present. The second patrol was scheduled for 2 a.m., but I waited until 2:20 a.m. to begin because of the restricted time period protocol. I stayed on the main concourse level and did a thorough check of all areas accessible without going to the platforms. Everything remained secure and quiet. At 2:31 a.m., I heard the first announcement. The voice was clear and professional, the kind of recorded message you'd hear at any transit station. Attention passengers. The 2:35 a.m. eastbound express to Riverside Park is now approaching Platform A. Please stand clear of the platform edge and allow exiting passengers to leave the train before boarding. I stayed at the security desk and logged it as a routine system maintenance audio check. The announcement was followed by what sounded like a train arriving. Not just the sound of an engine, but the full sequence. The approaching rumble, the squeal of brakes, the mechanical settling noises that trains make when they stop, and then the distinctive chime of doors opening. I waited. After about 30 seconds, the door chimes sounded again, followed by the gradual acceleration sounds of a train departing. Then silence. At 3:05 a.m., there was another announcement. Attention passengers. The 3:10 a.m. westbound local to Downtown Transit Center is now boarding on Platform B. This train will make all stops. Next train to Downtown Transit Center departs at 4:15 a.m. The same sequence followed. Arrival sounds, door chimes, departure sounds. I logged it as another routine maintenance audio check. Have you ever been in a place where everything sounded normal but felt completely wrong? What would you do if you were alone in that building right now? The rest of my first shift passed without incident. I completed 2 more patrols after the restricted time period ended, found everything secure and properly maintained, and left the building at 6 a.m. when the day's shift supervisor arrived. Janet called me that afternoon to ask how the first night had gone. I told her it was straightforward and mentioned the announcements during the restricted period. That's normal, she said. The system runs through its automated cycles regardless of whether the station is active. As long as you logged it properly, there's no concern. I worked 3 more shifts that week. Each night followed the same pattern. The building was secure and well maintained. During the restricted time period, there were train announcements and corresponding sounds from the platform level. I logged everything as routine maintenance activity and completed my patrols on schedule. The job was exactly what I'd needed. Quiet, predictable, and undemanding enough that I could manage it even on days when the treatment side effects were more pronounced. The health insurance would kick in after 90 days, and the schedule allowed me to maintain my medical appointments without conflicts. But by the end of the second week, I was starting to notice details that didn't align with Janet's explanations. The announcements followed a consistent schedule, but the times weren't round numbers that you'd expect from automated system maintenance. 2:35 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:10 a.m., 3:28 a.m. If these were system pings testing the announcement infrastructure, why wouldn't they occur at regular intervals? And why did they always include specific destination information that referenced locations throughout the Metropolitan Transit network? The sounds from the platform level were detailed enough that I began to distinguish between different types of trains. Some sounded like the standard electric rail cars used on the local service lines. Others had the deeper engine noise and longer braking distances of the express trains that serve the outer suburbs. A few sounded like equipment I didn't recognize, heavier and slower than normal passenger service. Most significantly, the computer terminal in the security office had started displaying arrival and departure information during my shifts. Not occasionally, as Janet had suggested, but consistently and in coordination with the announcements I was hearing. When the 2:35 a.m. eastbound express was announced, the departure board showed it leaving on time. When the 3:10 a.m. westbound local was called, it appeared on the arrivals list. I started taking notes in a personal notebook separate from the official incident logs. The announcement schedule, the types of trains I was hearing, and the information displays that corresponded to each. After 2 weeks of documentation, it was clear that this wasn't random system maintenance. It was a schedule. On my 15th shift, I decided to break the first rule. I waited until 2:30 a.m. during the restricted time period and went down to Platform A. Not because I thought I'd find anything dangerous or supernatural, but because I needed to confirm that the sounds were coming from automated equipment rather than actual trains. I needed to understand what kind of maintenance work produced such realistic audio effects. The platform level was exactly as I'd left it during my previous patrols. Clean, well-lit, and empty. The tracks showed no signs of recent use. There were no maintenance crews present, no equipment that could generate the sounds I'd been hearing, and no speakers visible that were powerful enough to produce the detailed audio that came through during the announcements. At 2:35 a.m., I heard the announcement for the eastbound express from the platform level rather than from above. Attention passengers. The 2:35 a.m. eastbound express to Riverside Park is now approaching Platform A. Please stand clear of the platform edge and allow exiting passengers to leave the train before boarding. I stood near the platform edge and listened carefully. The approaching train sound was coming from the tunnel to my left, the eastern direction. It grew louder and more defined as it approached, exactly as it would if a real train were traveling through the tunnel toward the station. But I could see into the tunnel for about 50 feet before it curved out of sight. There was nothing there. No lights, no movement, no physical source for the sound that was clearly originating from that direction. The braking sounds began when the approaching noise reached what should have been the platform area. I heard the mechanical settling, the door chimes, and the brief period of silence that would correspond to passenger boarding. Then the departure sequence, with the sound moving away toward the western tunnel until it faded completely. I walked to the western end of the platform and peered into that tunnel. Nothing. No retreating lights. No physical evidence that anything had passed through. The computer terminal in the security office showed the 2:35 a.m. eastbound express departing on time. I stayed on the platform level for the next announcement at 2:47 a.m. Same pattern, different destination. The 2:47 a.m. eastbound local to Millfield Heights, arriving on Platform A, doors opening and closing, departing on schedule. No physical source for any of the sounds. At 3:10 a.m., the westbound local was announced for Platform B. I moved to Platform B and observed the same sequence. Approaching from the western tunnel, stopping at the platform, doors opening and closing, departing toward the eastern tunnel. No train, but perfect audio reproduction of every detail you'd expect from a normal passenger service stop. When I completed my shift at 6 a.m., I didn't mention the rule violation to the day's shift supervisor, but I knew I'd crossed a line that would make it difficult to continue treating this job as routine security work. Janet called me the next afternoon. "I heard you had a quiet shift last night," she said. "Yes, everything was normal." "Good. I wanted to follow up on something. The protocols I gave you during training aren't arbitrary safety measures. They exist because the building's infrastructure has some unique characteristics that can create hazardous conditions if not properly respected. I want to make sure you understand that adherence to those protocols is essential for your safety as well as the security of the facility." "I understand." "Excellent. I also wanted to let you know that your performance so far has been exemplary. The incident logs are thorough and professional. The Municipal Security Office appreciates having someone reliable in that position." After Janet hung up, I realized she'd somehow known about my rule violation without my reporting it. The building was extensively monitored, and if she had access to security footage from the night before, she would have seen me on the platform level during the restricted period. But she hadn't confronted me directly or issued a formal reprimand. Instead, she'd reminded me about safety protocols in terms that suggested the restrictions were protective rather than administrative. I spent the weekend thinking about whether to continue the job. The pay was necessary and the health insurance was critical, but I was becoming convinced that whatever was happening at Eastwick Terminal was not routine system maintenance. On Monday night, I returned for my 16th shift with a different approach. Instead of trying to investigate or violate protocols, I would focus on understanding the situation well enough to work safely within it. I would treat it as a job with unusual but manageable requirements rather than a mystery that needed to be solved. The building felt familiar now. I knew the layout thoroughly, understood the patrol requirements, and had developed efficient routines for checking all areas and completing the required documentation. The work itself was straightforward if I focused on the security aspects and treated everything else as environmental conditions beyond my control. During the restricted time period, I remained on the main concourse level and continued logging the announcements as routine maintenance. But I also began paying closer attention to other details that might help me understand the broader context. The computer terminal displayed more than just arrival and departure information. During my shifts, it also showed maintenance schedules, crew assignments, and system status updates that seemed to reference ongoing operations throughout the Metropolitan Transit Network. Information that suggested Eastwick Terminal was still connected to the active system in ways that weren't obvious from the physical infrastructure. The passenger information displays throughout the building remained dark during normal hours, but I noticed they flickered on briefly during some of the announcement sequences. Not long enough to read specific information, but enough to confirm they were still receiving power and data feeds. Most significantly, I began to recognize patterns in the announcement schedule that corresponded to the actual transit system's peak and off-peak service periods. The 2:35 a.m. and 3:10 a.m. trains were positioned at times when the main system would normally be running limited overnight service to accommodate shift workers and late-night travelers. The destinations mentioned in the announcements were all locations served by the Eastern Line before it was rerouted. By the end of my third week, I had developed a working theory that made the situation manageable without requiring me to understand it completely. Eastwick Terminal was still functioning as part of the transit network, but not in a way that was visible or accessible to normal passengers. Whether this was for maintenance purposes, testing new systems, or serving some other administrative function wasn't my concern. My job was to monitor the building's security, document unusual activity, and follow protocols designed to keep me out of operational areas during active periods. This approach worked well until my 21st shift, when I encountered my first passenger. I was completing a routine patrol around 1:45 a.m., checking the main concourse level before the restricted time period began. As I walked past the central waiting area, I saw an elderly woman sitting on one of the bench seats near the electronic departure board. She was wearing a dark blue coat and carrying a small-wheeled suitcase, the kind designed for short trips. She appeared to be waiting. I approached her carefully, following the protocol for individuals found in the building. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm building security. Can you tell me how you got in here tonight?" She looked up at me with the expression of someone who'd been asked an obvious question. "Through the main entrance, of course. I'm waiting for the 2:35 to Riverside Park." "Ma'am, this station is no longer in active service. The trains don't stop here anymore. The nearest operating station is Millbrook Junction, about 2 miles north of here." She checked her watch and frowned. "That can't be right. I've been taking this train twice a week for 15 years. Same route, same schedule. I checked the departure board online before I left home tonight." I looked at the departure board she'd indicated. It was dark, as it had been every night since I'd started working here. "What time did you arrive tonight?" "Around 2:15. The train's usually on time." I checked my own watch. It was 1:52 a.m. If she'd arrived at 2:15, she had been waiting in the building for over 3 hours without my seeing her during my earlier patrols. "Ma'am, could you show me how you entered the building? All the entrances are locked after operating hours." She pointed toward the main entrance area. The doors were open when I arrived. There was an attendant at the information desk who confirmed my train was on schedule. I'd walked through the main entrance area twice during my shift. The doors had been securely locked, and there was no attendant desk staffed at any time during overnight hours. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to come with me to the security office so I can help you make arrangements to get to Millbrook Junction." "Young man, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going to miss my train because of some administrative confusion. The 2:35 eastbound express runs every Tuesday and Friday night, and it stops at Platform A. I'll be boarding in about 40 minutes. I looked at my watch again. 1:54 a.m. She was referencing the exact train that would be announced at 2:35 a.m. during the restricted time period. According to protocol, I should have contacted municipal security if she refused to leave or insisted that trains were still running. But something about her certainty made me hesitate. She wasn't confused or disoriented. She was describing specific, accurate information about the announcement schedule I'd been documenting for 3 weeks. "Ma'am, have you taken this train recently? I mean, within the past few months." "Every Tuesday and Friday for the past 15 years, like I said. Sometimes the schedule changes slightly for maintenance, but they always announce modifications in advance." "And you've never had any problems with service interruptions or route changes?" "Occasionally there are delays due to signal problems or equipment issues, but the service has been quite reliable overall. Much better than the bus routes they use for temporary replacements." She was describing an active, ongoing service that I knew didn't exist. But she was also referencing details about the Metropolitan Transit System that were accurate, including the signal problems and temporary bus services that I knew were part of the normal operations on other lines. I made a decision that violated both protocol and common sense. Instead of calling municipal security, I decided to stay with her until 2:35 a.m. to see what would happen when her train was announced. "Ma'am, would you mind if I waited with you until your train arrives? I'm still fairly new to this position, and I'd like to understand the station's operations better." "Of course, dear. Though I should mention that passengers aren't typically allowed to bring security personnel onto the trains unless there's an emergency. We sat together in the central waiting area. She told me her name was Margaret and that she worked as a night auditor at a hotel in Riverside Park. She'd been taking the 2:35 a.m. train for her Tuesday and Friday shifts since she'd started the job 15 years ago. The return trip was usually the 6:15 a.m. westbound express, which got her home in time to have breakfast and get some sleep before her next shift. Her description of the routine was detailed and consistent. She knew the conductors by name, had preferred seats on different cars depending on the season, and could describe the other regular passengers who traveled the same route. She talked about construction delays that had affected the schedule in previous years, service upgrades that had improved reliability, and fare changes that had been implemented during the time she'd been using the route. Everything she told me sounded like the experience of someone who had been using an active transit service regularly for many years. At 2:17 a.m., I excused myself briefly to check that we were alone in the building. The main concourse level was empty except for Margaret, and all the entrances remained securely locked. I returned to the waiting area. At 2:30 a.m., Margaret gathered her suitcase and began moving toward the stairs to Platform A. The train usually arrives a few minutes early, she explained. I like to be on the platform in case they make up time due to light passenger loads. I followed her downstairs, violating the restricted time period protocol for the second time. Platform A was empty and showed no signs of any preparation for an arriving train. The tracks were clear, the tunnel entrances were dark, and there was no equipment present that could produce the sounds I'd been hearing during previous shifts. Margaret positioned herself near the platform edge, in the area where the front car would stop if a train were actually arriving. She checked her watch and nodded approvingly. Right on time, she said. At 2:35 a.m., the announcement played. Attention passengers. The 2:35 a.m. eastbound express to Riverside Park is now approaching Platform A. Please stand clear of the platform edge and allow exiting passengers to leave the train before boarding. Margaret stepped back from the platform edge as instructed. The approaching train sounds began from the eastern tunnel. The same audio sequence I'd observed multiple times, but now I was watching Margaret respond to it, as if she could see something I couldn't. She gathered her suitcase handle and moved closer to where the doors would be. The braking sounds, the mechanical settling, and then the door chimes. Margaret stepped forward as if boarding a train. She turned back to me and smiled. Thank you for the company, dear. Have a good rest of your shift. She walked forward about 6 feet, then simply wasn't there anymore. I stood on the empty platform listening to the departure sounds fade toward the western tunnel. The computer terminal upstairs would show the 2:35 a.m. eastbound express departing on time, with Margaret presumably aboard. If this story is keeping you hooked, a quick like helps more people discover stories like this one. I spent the rest of my shift trying to process what I'd observed. The most rational explanation was that I'd experienced some kind of hallucination or medical episode related to my treatment. The medications I was taking had documented side effects that could include visual disturbances and confusion. It was possible that I'd imagined the entire interaction with Margaret. But when I completed my incident log at the end of the shift, I found that I had detailed notes in my personal notebook about our conversation, written in my own handwriting. Notes that included specific information about transit operations that I didn't know before talking with her. I also found a small piece of paper on the platform where she'd been standing. A transit ticket stub, dated that night, for the 2:35 a.m. eastbound express from Eastwick Terminal to Riverside Park. Janet called me that afternoon. She didn't ask about my shift directly, but mentioned that the Municipal Transportation Authority was conducting a review of security protocols at decommissioned facilities. There have been some questions raised about passenger access to buildings that are no longer in active service, she said. We want to make sure that anyone working security at these locations understands the importance of maintaining controlled access during all hours of operation. Has there been a problem with unauthorized entry? Not exactly unauthorized. More a matter of making sure that access is properly coordinated with operational requirements. Some of these facilities serve multiple purposes beyond what's immediately obvious, and security personnel need to work within those broader operational contexts. I understand. I'm confident you do. Your incident reports have been thorough and demonstrate good judgment. The Transportation Authority values having someone reliable in that position. After the call, I realized that Janet was indicating she knew about my interaction with Margaret, but was framing it as part of normal operations rather than a security breach. This suggested that encounters with passengers like Margaret were expected, even if they weren't explicitly covered in the written protocols. I returned to work that night with a different understanding of my role. I wasn't just monitoring an empty building for unauthorized access. I was working security for a facility that was still operational in ways that weren't immediately apparent. My job was to maintain appropriate boundaries between whatever was happening at Eastwick Terminal and the normal world outside, while allowing authorized activities to continue safely. This new framework made the situation more manageable. I could focus on doing my job professionally without needing to understand every aspect of what was happening around me. The key was recognizing which activities fell within my area of responsibility and which were part of operations I wasn't meant to interfere with. Over the following weeks, I encountered passengers on approximately 60% of my shifts, always during the hours that corresponded to the announcement schedule, always individuals who appeared to be regular users of specific routes, and always people who responded to the train sounds as if they were boarding actual transportation. I developed a standard approach for these encounters. I would greet them politely, confirm that they were waiting for scheduled service, and wish them well for their journey. I stopped trying to redirect them to active stations or questioning their presence in the building. According to their understanding of the situation, they were using legitimate transit services, and my role was to ensure their safety while they waited, not to challenge the nature of those services. The passengers were helpful in filling in details about the broader context of Eastwick Terminal's operations. From conversations with regular travelers, I learned that the station served several routes that weren't available through the main metropolitan transit system. Express services to locations that would otherwise require multiple transfers and connections. Overnight routes that accommodated shift workers and healthcare personnel. Specialty services that ran on schedules designed around specific employment needs. Most of the passengers had been using these services for years, and they described them as reliable and well-maintained. They appreciated the direct routes and the convenience of departures that were timed to their work schedules. Several mentioned that they'd tried to recommend the services to friends and colleagues, but that somehow people who weren't already familiar with the routes had difficulty finding information about them or accessing the stations. By my second month on the job, I had settled into a routine that felt sustainable. The work was predictable, the passengers were generally pleasant to interact with, and I was becoming proficient at managing the administrative requirements of the position. The health insurance would begin at the end of the month, and the treatment costs would become much more manageable. But there were still aspects of the situation that didn't fit within my understanding of normal transit operations, even accounting for the unusual passenger access procedures. The most significant was the administrative level. According to Janet, the upper floor of the building housed offices that were no longer active and required electronic key cards that had been deactivated. But I could see lights in several of the windows when I approached the building from outside, and I occasionally heard what sounded like office activity during my shifts. Phones ringing, printers running, and the general background noise of people working. During my 8th week, I decided to investigate the administrative level more thoroughly, not by trying to access it, which would violate clear protocols, but by observing it more systematically to understand what kind of activity was taking place there. The stairwell to the administrative level was accessible from the main concourse. The door at the bottom was unlocked, and I could climb the stairs to the upper level. The door at the top displayed an electronic lock system with a card reader, but I could hear sounds from the other side clearly enough to distinguish different types of activity. During normal business hours, the sounds were consistent with office work. Phone conversations, computer keyboards, file cabinets opening and closing, and people moving around. During overnight hours, there was still activity, but different in character. More technical sounds, equipment running, and what seemed like coordination activities involving multiple people. The elevator that served the administrative level was locked, as Janet had indicated, but the elevator indicator showed regular use during my shifts. It moved between floors throughout the night, suggesting that people were accessing the upper level even when the main building appeared to be empty except for me and the occasional passengers waiting for trains. I began timing the elevator activity against the announcement schedule and discovered a clear correlation. The elevator was most active during the periods just before and after the train announcements, as if staff were coordinating with the arrival and departure sequences. This suggested that the train services weren't completely automated. There were people actively involved in managing the operations, working from the administrative level during the hours when the trains were running. On my 60th shift, I encountered someone who wasn't a passenger. I was completing a routine patrol around 3:45 a.m. when I saw a man in a maintenance uniform walking through the main concourse area. He was carrying a toolbox and appeared to be heading toward one of the service corridors that led to utility areas throughout the building. I approached him following the standard protocol for unscheduled personnel in the building. "Excuse me, sir. I'm building security. Are you here for scheduled maintenance work?" He stopped and turned toward me, middle-aged, with the kind of practical appearance you'd expect from someone who worked on building systems. His uniform shirt had a name tag that read Williams and a logo for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. "Evening shift mechanical inspection," he said. "We're running diagnostics on the ventilation systems before the temperature changes next month. Should be finished within a couple hours. I don't have any maintenance scheduled on tonight's activity log. Could you show me your work order?" He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it to me. It was a standard municipal maintenance request form, properly filled out and signed by supervisors I recognized from other paperwork I'd processed during my time at the station. The work description matched what he'd told me, and the authorization codes appeared to be legitimate. But the date on the form was from 1987. "Mr. Williams, this work order is dated from when the station first opened. Are you sure this is the correct paperwork for tonight's job?" He looked at the form and nodded. "That's right. We've been working through a backlog of maintenance items that were deferred during the initial construction phase. Some of the building systems were installed, but never properly tested under operational conditions. Now that the station's been in service for a while, we can identify issues that only become apparent during regular use." I looked at the form again. The date was clearly 1987, but he was describing it as current work, and he was referring to the station as being in service, despite it being officially decommissioned in 2019. "How long have you been working on this maintenance backlog?" "About 15 years, I'd say. We work mostly overnight shifts when the building's less busy. Easier to run diagnostics without interfering with normal operations." "And you have regular access to the building during overnight hours?" "Sure. The administrative level coordinates maintenance schedules with security and operational requirements. We just don't always get the paperwork down to the security desk in advance. Sometimes jobs get moved around depending on parts availability or crew schedules. He was describing a normal maintenance operation, but one that had been ongoing since before I'd started working at the station. If there were regular maintenance crews working in the building, it would explain some of the sounds and activity I'd observed, but it also meant that my understanding of the building's operational status was incomplete. Would it be helpful if I stayed in contact during your work tonight? In case you need access to any secured areas or run into building systems that require security clearance. That's thoughtful, but we're familiar with the building layout and have access to most areas we need for mechanical work. If we run into anything unusual, we know how to contact the coordination office upstairs. He gestured toward the ceiling, indicating the administrative level. The coordination office is staffed during overnight hours? Certainly. They maintain operational oversight for all the services that run through the station. Scheduling, passenger coordination, equipment monitoring. The usual operational support you'd expect for a facility this size. Williams walked toward the service corridor and paused near the entrance. I should mention, if you hear equipment sounds or see activity lights in areas where you don't normally patrol, that's likely related to our maintenance work. We sometimes need to access mechanical spaces and utility areas throughout the building. Nothing to be concerned about from a security standpoint. He disappeared into the service corridor, and I heard the sound of his footsteps and the toolbox moving deeper into the building's utility areas. I completed my patrol and returned to the security office to document the encounter. The interaction had been professional and routine, but it had also provided information that significantly changed my understanding of how Eastwick Terminal operated during overnight hours. There was an active administrative office on the upper level that coordinated multiple types of operations throughout the building. There were regular maintenance crews who had been working on building systems for 15 years, using work orders that dated back to the station's original construction. And there were operational services that required scheduling, passenger coordination, and equipment monitoring on a scale that suggested much more activity than I'd been aware of. I realized that my role as overnight security was focused on the main concourse and platform levels, which represented only a portion of what was happening in the building during my shifts. The administrative level, the utility areas, and the service corridors were part of an operational infrastructure that I was meant to monitor for general security purposes, but not actively supervise or interfere with. This understanding made the job clearer and more straightforward. I was responsible for ensuring that the publicly accessible areas of the building remained secure, that passengers using the transit services could do so safely, and that unauthorized individuals didn't interfere with ongoing operations. The technical and administrative aspects of how those operations functioned were outside my area of responsibility. Over the following month, I became more comfortable with the broader scope of activity at Eastwick Terminal. I regularly encountered maintenance personnel working throughout the building, passengers using the various transit services, and evidence of administrative coordination that kept everything running smoothly. The pay was adequate. The work was manageable despite the unusual operational context, and the health insurance had resolved the financial pressure that had originally motivated me to take the position. I was sleeping better, had more energy during the day, and was able to maintain my medical appointments without the stress of wondering how I'd pay for ongoing treatment. But there were still questions about the nature of the transit services that operated through the station. Questions that became more pressing when I encountered Dr. Sarah Chun. I met Dr. Chun during my 73rd shift, around 4:20 a.m. She was waiting in the main concourse area, dressed in business attire and carrying a briefcase and a small overnight bag. Unlike the other passengers I'd encountered, who typically seemed familiar with the station's routines, she appeared to be studying her surroundings with the attention of someone visiting for the first time. I approached her using my standard greeting for passengers. "Good morning." Are you waiting for one of the scheduled departures? She looked up from the notebook she'd been writing in. Yes, I believe so. The 4:45 a.m. express to the research complex. Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure I'm in the right place. I wasn't familiar with a 4:45 a.m. departure, and I'd never heard any of the regular passengers mention a research complex as a destination. I don't have that specific route in my information. Most of the services that run through here are eastbound and westbound along the main corridor routes. What type of research complex are you trying to reach? The Federal Biomedical Research Facility, about 60 miles north of the city. I was told there's a direct shuttle service that runs from certain transit stations, but the scheduling information I received was somewhat vague. She showed me a memo printed on official letterhead from the Department of Health and Human Services. It referenced transportation arrangements for contract researchers attending a conference at a facility I'd never heard of, with instructions to arrive at Eastwick Terminal by 4:30 a.m. for a 4:45 a.m. departure. Dr. Chen, how did you hear about this station? It's not listed on any of the public transit schedules. A colleague gave me the information, Dr. Martinez, who attended a similar conference last year. He said the transportation arrangements were handled through specialized services that aren't part of the regular metropolitan system. He mentioned that the access procedures were somewhat unconventional, but that the service itself was reliable and efficient. And you're a researcher? Epidemiologist with the Centers for Disease Control. I specialize in tracking unusual disease patterns and investigating potential biological hazards. The conference I'm attending focuses on interagency coordination for monitoring and responding to emerging health threats. Dr. Chun was describing a legitimate professional role and a plausible reason for traveling to a federal research facility. But she was also indicating that there were transportation services operating through Eastwick Terminal that connected to government facilities I'd never heard mentioned by other passengers. Have you used these specialized transportation services before? No, this is my first time. Dr. Martinez warned me that the procedures might seem unusual compared to normal public transit, but he assured me that the security measures were appropriate given the sensitive nature of some of the facilities served. At 4:40 a.m., there was an announcement I'd never heard before. Attention passengers traveling to Federal Research Complex North. The 4:45 a.m. secure transport is now boarding on Platform C. Please have your authorization documentation ready for verification. This is a restricted service requiring advance clearance. Dr. Chen gathered her bags and moved toward the stairs leading to Platform C, the platform that had never been used during any of my previous shifts. I followed her, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to ensure her safety if she was boarding some type of specialized government transportation. Platform C was identical in layout to platforms A and B, but it felt different. The lighting was slightly brighter, and there were additional security features that I hadn't noticed before. Camera installations that were more sophisticated than those on the other platforms, and what appeared to be scanning equipment near the platform edge. Dr. Chin positioned herself in the boarding area and waited. At 4:45 a.m., the sounds began from the northern tunnel, a direction I hadn't heard train activity from before. But these sounds were different from the regular passenger service. Heavier, more mechanical, and with additional audio elements that suggested more complex equipment than standard rail cars. The arrival sequence was longer and more involved than normal passenger service. Extended braking sounds, multiple mechanical settling sequences, and then a series of door chimes that indicated several cars rather than the single car that seemed to serve most of the regular routes. Dr. Chun moved forward to board, then turned back to me. Thank you for your assistance. I should be back on the return shuttle sometime this evening if you're working later shifts. She walked toward where the doors would be and disappeared, just as Margaret, and the other passengers had done. But unlike the regular passenger services, the departure sequence for Dr. Chin's transport continued for several minutes. Extended mechanical sounds, what seemed like equipment checks, and communications that sounded like radio coordination between multiple personnel. When the sounds finally faded toward the northern tunnel, I realized that I'd witnessed something fundamentally different from the regular transit services. This had been a specialized government transport serving federal facilities, operating through infrastructure that connected Eastwick Terminal to locations that weren't part of the normal metropolitan network. If you're finding these revelations as unsettling as I did, subscribing really helps the channel grow and ensures you won't miss what comes next. I spent the rest of my shift processing the implications of what I'd observed. Eastwick Terminal wasn't just serving regular passengers who needed alternative routes through the metropolitan area. It was also providing access to government transportation services that connected to federal facilities and research complexes. This explained the administrative coordination I'd observed, the sophisticated security infrastructure, and the careful protocols that governed access to different areas of the building. The station was functioning as a hub for multiple types of transportation services, some of which served sensitive government operations that required security measures beyond those needed for normal public transit. When Janet called me that afternoon, I mentioned my interaction with Dr. Chun and asked about the federal transportation services. Yes, those arrangements are part of a broader interagency coordination program, she said. Certain government departments require specialized transportation to facilities that aren't accessible through regular public routes. The Transportation Authority provides hub services for those operations as part of its federal oversight responsibilities. Are there many government researchers who use these services? Not frequently, but regularly enough that we maintain the necessary clearance procedures and coordination protocols. Most of them are involved in work that requires high-level security clearances, so their transportation needs have to be managed separately from general public access. And the specialized platforms and equipment. Standard security infrastructure for federal transportation services. The same type of equipment you'd find at any facility that serves government personnel with classified responsibilities. Janet's explanation was straightforward and consistent with what I'd observed. Eastwick Terminal served as a transportation hub for multiple types of services, including federal operations that required enhanced security measures. My role was to provide general building security while allowing authorized operations to function normally. But over the following weeks, I began to notice that the government transportation services operated on different principles from the regular passenger routes. The regular passengers seemed to be using alternative versions of normal metropolitan transit, with familiar destinations and conventional schedules. The government services seemed to be connecting to locations and facilities that existed outside the normal geographical and administrative structure of the region. Dr. Chen returned on her scheduled evening transport and was willing to talk about her experience at the research complex. The conference was productive, she said, though I have to admit, the facility itself was unlike any government installation I've worked with before. In what way? The research they're conducting is much more advanced than what I'd expected. They're working on biological monitoring systems that can track disease patterns in real time across large populations. Detection methods that can identify emerging threats weeks before they become visible through conventional epidemiological surveillance. That sounds like valuable work for public health preparedness. It is, but it also raises questions about data collection methods and the scope of monitoring that's being conducted. Some of the systems they showed us could track individual health indicators at the cellular level across entire metropolitan areas without requiring any direct testing or medical contact. Dr. Chun was describing research capabilities that seemed to exceed what I understood about current medical technology. But she was also indicating that the government facilities served by the transportation services at Eastwick Terminal were involved in advanced research programs that weren't part of normal public health operations. Did you meet other researchers at the conference? Yes, about 30 people from various agencies and institutions. Most of them seem to be involved in monitoring programs that focus on unusual biological patterns or environmental threats. Several mentioned ongoing projects that track changes in population health that can't be explained through conventional disease transmission models. Changes like what? Synchronized behavior patterns across large groups of people. Physiological responses that occur simultaneously in individuals with no apparent connection to each other. Cellular modifications that appear in multiple locations at the same time without any identifiable source of transmission. She was describing research into biological phenomena that sounded like they went beyond normal public health concerns. Research that might explain why the government transportation services required specialized security measures and why the facilities they served weren't accessible through normal routes. Dr. Chun, do you think this research is related to any specific threats or problems that the government is trying to address? I'm not certain, but several of the presentations suggested that the monitoring systems have detected patterns that indicate some type of ongoing biological influence affecting large populations. The researchers seem to believe that these patterns represent a significant but not widely recognized threat to public health. What kind of biological influence? That wasn't made clear. But the monitoring data they showed us indicated changes in human physiology and behavior that are occurring simultaneously across geographically separated populations. Changes that suggest some type of external factor is influencing biological systems in ways that conventional medical science doesn't currently understand. Dr. Chin's description suggested that the government research facilities were investigating biological phenomena that might be related to the unusual transportation services operating through Eastwick Terminal. Services that seemed to function outside normal physical and administrative constraints. Over the following month, I encountered several other government personnel using the specialized transportation services. Military researchers, environmental scientists, and technical specialists working on projects that involved monitoring and responding to unusual phenomena. All of them described work that seemed to involve biological or environmental factors that existed outside the scope of normal scientific understanding. Most significantly, several of them mentioned that the research programs they were involved in had been ongoing for much longer than I'd expected. Some referenced projects that had been running for decades, with research that built on data collection and monitoring systems that had been in place since the 1980s. This suggested that the transportation services at Eastwick Terminal and the facilities they connected to were part of a long-term government program that had been operating for much of the time since the station had originally been built. During my 4th month of employment, I decided to investigate the connection between the regular passenger services and the government transportation services more systematically. I wanted to understand whether they were separate systems that happened to use the same infrastructure or whether they were part of a broader integrated operation. I started by documenting the scheduling patterns for both types of services. The regular passenger routes operated on consistent schedules that corresponded to normal work and travel patterns. Early morning departures for people traveling to work, evening returns for people traveling home, and late-night services that accommodated shift workers and other off-hours travelers. The government transportation services operated on different schedules that seemed to be coordinated around research activities and facility operations. Irregular departure times that corresponded to conference dates, project schedules, and coordination meetings. longer intervals between services, but with more complex equipment and extended boarding procedures. But I also noticed that both types of services used the same announcement systems, the same platform infrastructure, and what appeared to be the same coordination systems operating from the administrative level. The computer terminal in the security office displayed scheduling and status information for both types of services, suggesting they were managed through the same operational framework. Most significantly, I began to recognize that some of the regular passengers were also involved in the government research programs. People I'd been interacting with for months as normal commuters were occasionally departing on the specialized government transports, returning from federal research facilities, or carrying documentation that indicated they were involved in the monitoring programs that other government personnel had described. Margaret, the elderly woman who had been my first passenger encounter, was among them. During one of our conversations, while she waited for her regular train to Riverside Park, she mentioned that she occasionally attended coordination meetings at government facilities as part of her work responsibilities. What type of coordination meetings? Community health monitoring. I provide information about patterns I observe in the neighborhood where I work. Changes in behavior, health complaints, unusual incidents that might be relevant to the broader monitoring programs. And this is part of your job at the hotel. Not exactly part of my official job responsibilities, but related to work I've been doing for many years. I'm what they call a community liaison for biological monitoring programs. I report observations that might be relevant to research into environmental factors affecting public health. Margaret was describing a role that connected her regular work as a night auditor to the government research programs that used the specialized transportation services. She was part of a community monitoring network that provided information to federal researchers about biological and behavioral patterns that might not be visible through conventional public health surveillance. How long have you been involved in this type of monitoring work? About 15 years, since shortly after I started taking the train from this station. The Transportation Coordination Office upstairs connected me with researchers who were looking for people in positions to observe large numbers of community members on a regular basis. Hotel work provides good opportunities to notice changes in travel patterns, behavior, and health indicators among people from throughout the metropolitan area. And other passengers who use the services here are involved in similar monitoring work. Many of them, yes. The transportation services that operate through this station serve people who are involved in different aspects of the monitoring programs. Some are professional researchers, some are community liaisons like me, and some are involved in technical support or coordination activities. Margaret was indicating that the regular passenger services at Eastwick Terminal weren't just alternative routes through the metropolitan transit system. They were part of a transportation network that served a community of people involved in long-term government research and monitoring programs. This explained the consistency and reliability of the passenger services, the detailed knowledge that regular travelers had about the system, and the reason that information about the services wasn't readily available to people who weren't already connected to the programs they served. During my 5th month, I encountered Dr. Williams, the supervisor whom Margaret had mentioned during our conversations. I found him in the main concourse area around 5:30 a.m., reviewing paperwork and apparently waiting for one of the early morning departure services. He was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex operations. I approached him using my standard procedure for government personnel. "Good morning, sir. I'm building security. Are you traveling on one of the scheduled services this morning?" He looked up from his paperwork and smiled. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you. You're Marcus, correct? The overnight security coordinator for this facility." "Yes, sir." "Excellent. I'm Dr. Williams from the Federal Biological Monitoring Coordination Office. I oversee the research programs that use transportation services through this station. I've been meaning to introduce myself and thank you for the professional work you've been doing here. Thank you, sir. I've met several of the researchers and government personnel who travel through here. They've all been very professional and easy to work with. Good to hear. I understand you've been asking thoughtful questions about the scope and nature of the programs we operate. That kind of careful attention is exactly what we need in a security coordinator for a facility like this. Dr. Williams was indicating that he was aware of the questions I'd been asking passengers about the government research programs. But he seemed to view my curiosity as appropriate professional interest rather than as a potential security concern. Sir, I've been trying to understand my role and responsibilities better. The operations here are more complex than I'd initially realized, and I want to make sure I'm providing appropriate security support. That's exactly the kind of professional approach we value. Let me explain the broader context, which should help you understand how the various services and programs connect to each other. Dr. Williams gestured toward the seating area, and we sat down while he organized his paperwork. The federal government has been conducting long-term biological monitoring programs since the early 1980s, he said. These programs track population health patterns, environmental factors, and biological changes that might indicate emerging threats to public safety. The transportation services that operate through Eastwick Terminal connect the various personnel involved in these programs with research facilities, coordination centers, and community monitoring sites throughout the region. He explained that the monitoring programs had detected biological and behavioral patterns in the population that couldn't be explained through conventional scientific models. Patterns that suggested some type of external influence was affecting human physiology in ways that required ongoing investigation and response. The people who use the transportation services here are part of a coordinated effort to understand and monitor these influences, Dr. Williams continued. Community liaisons like Margaret provide observational data from their regular work environments. Researchers like Dr. Chun analyze the biological mechanisms involved. Technical personnel maintain the monitoring systems that track changes across large populations. And coordination staff like myself ensure that information flows between different parts of the program effectively. And the transportation system itself? The transportation system serves locations and facilities that are part of the monitoring infrastructure. Some of these locations exist within the normal geographical framework of the region, while others are positioned in ways that allow for specialized research and coordination activities that require enhanced security and isolation measures. Dr. Williams was describing a comprehensive government program that had been operating for decades, using specialized infrastructure to monitor and respond to biological phenomena that weren't part of normal public health operations. The transportation services at Eastwick Terminal were part of this infrastructure, connecting personnel and facilities involved in ongoing research and monitoring activities. Dr. Williams, is there anything specific I should know about security protocols or operational procedures that would help me do my job more effectively? You've been doing excellent work already. Continue monitoring the building for unauthorized access, ensuring passenger safety, and maintaining appropriate boundaries between the various operational activities and the general public. The Administrative Coordination Office will continue to provide guidance for any unusual situations that arise. He gathered his paperwork and moved toward Platform B as the 6:15 a.m. westbound departure was announced. Thank you for the professional approach you've maintained here, Marcus. The research programs depend on having reliable, discreet security support, and you've provided exactly that. Dr. Williams boarded his train, and I completed my shift knowing that I was part of a long-term government program that monitored biological phenomena affecting the entire metropolitan population. My role was to provide security support for transportation services that connected personnel involved in this monitoring work with the facilities and coordination centers they needed to access. The work had become routine and manageable. The pay covered my expenses, the health insurance had resolved the financial pressure from medical bills, and I had developed efficient procedures for handling the various types of passengers and personnel who used the services at Eastwick Terminal. But I also knew that I was involved in something much larger than routine security work, something that had been ongoing for decades and that involved biological phenomena that conventional science didn't fully understand. What would you do if you discovered you were working inside a program that had been monitoring the entire population for biological changes? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. 6 months after I'd started working at Eastwick Terminal, the treatment for my cancer was declared successful. My oncologist scheduled follow-up appointments every 3 months instead of every month, and the medication regimen was reduced to a maintenance level that had minimal side effects. The diagnosis that had forced me to find work I could manage despite physical limitations was no longer the defining factor in my daily life. I could have looked for other employment, work that paid better or offered more conventional career advancement opportunities. But I chose to stay at Eastwick Terminal. The job had become something I understood and could perform well. The unusual operational context no longer seemed threatening or confusing. It was simply the environment where I worked, with its own procedures and requirements that I'd learned to navigate professionally. Margaret still took the 2:35 a.m. eastbound express twice a week. Dr. Chun occasionally traveled to research facilities on the specialized government transports. Williams and other maintenance personnel continued their work on building systems that had been in operation for 15 years. The Administrative Coordination Office maintained oversight for services that connected personnel throughout the biological monitoring programs with the facilities they needed to access. I still don't fully understand the nature of the biological phenomena that the monitoring programs are investigating. I don't know what type of external influences are affecting population health in ways that require specialized research and response capabilities. And I don't know how the transportation services that operate through Eastwick Terminal function outside the normal physical and administrative constraints that govern other transit systems. But I know that my role is to provide security support for operations that serve people involved in important work. Work that requires careful coordination, enhanced security measures, and transportation services that can connect personnel with specialized facilities and research centers. The cancer treatment changed how I think about what's normal and what's possible. Before the diagnosis, I assumed that the systems and institutions around me operated in ways that were completely transparent and predictable. The experience of navigating medical treatments, insurance procedures, and work arrangements while managing an illness that threatened everything I'd taken for granted taught me that much of what affects our lives happens through processes we don't see or understand. Working at Eastwick Terminal feels like an extension of that lesson. There are biological and environmental factors affecting all of us that require ongoing monitoring and research. There are government programs that coordinate responses to phenomena that aren't part of normal public awareness. And there are transportation systems that connect the people involved in this work with the facilities and resources they need to carry it out effectively. My job is to provide security support for part of this infrastructure, to ensure that personnel can travel safely to research facilities and coordination centers, that unauthorized individuals don't interfere with sensitive operations, and that the boundary between the specialized work being conducted and normal public life is maintained appropriately. The work feels meaningful and necessary. It also feels like something I'm suited for, Given the experience I've gained navigating medical and administrative systems that operate outside the framework of normal public understanding, I still take notes in my personal notebook about the patterns I observe in passenger schedules, government personnel activities, and the coordination systems that manage operations throughout the building. But now I take those notes as part of contributing to the security and operational effectiveness of the programs I support, rather than as an attempt to solve mysteries or understand phenomena that are outside my area of responsibility. The health insurance covers my ongoing medical expenses completely. The pay allows me to live comfortably without financial stress. And the work provides me with a sense of contributing to something important, even if I don't understand all aspects of what that contribution supports. If you want to hear more stories about the hidden systems that operate around us, hit that notification bell so you don't miss what I discover next. Last week, Margaret asked me if I'd ever considered taking one of the trains myself. Where would I go? I asked. That depends on what kind of work you're interested in, she said. The coordination office upstairs sometimes has openings for people with security experience who want to get more involved in the monitoring programs. Community liaison work, facility security, coordination support. The kind of work that uses the skills you've developed here, but gives you a broader understanding of what the programs are trying to accomplish. I told her I'd think about it. The truth is, I've become comfortable with my current role and the level of involvement it requires. I provide security support for transportation services that connect people with important work. I maintain appropriate boundaries between specialized operations and normal public life. And I do this work reliably and professionally, without needing to understand every aspect of the broader programs I support. But I've also started to notice changes in my own health and awareness that might be related to the biological phenomena the monitoring programs are investigating. Changes that are subtle but consistent, and that seem to correspond to patterns other personnel have mentioned in their conversations about the research they're involved in. I sleep differently now. Not worse or better, just differently. My dreams are more vivid and often include locations and people I don't recognize, but that feel familiar. I wake up with information about things I haven't experienced directly, as if my understanding of the world around me is being updated through processes I'm not conscious of. My energy levels are more consistent throughout the day, even on days when I'm working overnight shifts and sleeping during daylight hours. My appetite has changed in ways that seem to be guiding me toward foods and nutrients that support the work I'm doing, though I couldn't explain how I know this. Most significantly, I've begun to sense the presence of the passengers and government personnel before I see them. Not in a supernatural way, but as if my awareness of the building and its operational patterns has become more comprehensive than what I can perceive through normal observation. These changes don't feel threatening or problematic. They feel like adaptations that make me more effective at the work I'm doing and more connected to the operational environment I'm part of. But they also suggest that working at Eastwick Terminal involves more than just providing security support for transportation services. Margaret was right that there might be opportunities for me to become more directly involved in the monitoring programs. But I'm not sure whether that's something I want to pursue, or whether my current role provides the right level of involvement for someone with my background and interests. The cancer treatment taught me that some decisions about health and medical care have to be made without complete information about outcomes or long-term effects. You make the best choices you can based on what you understand about your situation and what resources are available to you, then adapt to whatever changes result from those choices. Working at Eastwick Terminal feels like a similar type of decision. I'm involved in something important that I don't fully understand, using skills I've developed to contribute to work that serves purposes beyond what I can see directly. The changes I'm experiencing might be side effects of working in an environment that's connected to biological monitoring programs. They might be adaptations that make me more effective at security work in a facility that operates outside normal administrative frameworks. Or they might be unrelated to my work and simply part of the ongoing recovery process from cancer treatment. I don't have enough information to determine which explanation is most accurate, and I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that I can do the work effectively, that it provides me with the financial security and health insurance I need, and that it feels like a meaningful contribution to something larger than my individual circumstances. The medical bills are paid, the treatment was successful, and I have work that I understand and can perform well, even if the broader context involves biological phenomena and government programs that operate outside the framework of normal public awareness. I still check my phone when I wake up each afternoon, just to make sure the date matches what I expect it to be.